Okay, so Kyle, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the podcast.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Great. So, for the listeners who may not have heard about you or seen you on the Instagram, could you just give us a brief overview of who you are and what it is you do at the moment?
Yeah, I've been in the industry for just under 15 years. I've worked as a trainer, an individual facility manager, a multi-club manager, and then a education and fitness director at the national level for a few different companies. And over the last year and a half or so, I've kind of broken away and started doing my own thing. And I currently run my own business, Compound Performance, where I work with individual trainers from a mentorship and development standpoint, but I also I have a group format where I work with about 50 people right now and under that. And then I also consult with several small facilities as well, just from a general business development, systems development, educational pathways standpoint. So,
Great. And just before the call as well, you said that you were doing a master's at the moment as well. You're finding time to throw that in there.
yeah, I'm also looking at psychology, something that has been an interest of mine for a long time. I found out very early in my career that regardless of training expertise and technical competencies, most of our clients recognize the experience of training much more than the actual act of training, and value that process. And that whole, communication and more cognitive psychological setup is something that really, captured my attention early on. And I started reading more and more about it, just diving into everything from autonomics and Sapolsky to polyvagal theory into actual psychology books, textbooks and the like. And finally kind of jumped in and went back to school. So I'm in a graduate program now for actual organizational psychology, which I'm hoping or intending for down the road, that'll allow me to take my business from a consulting perspective into larger organizations so that I can now look at both corporate wellness and human resources all in one. So a little dual purpose there, a little bit of a growth mechanism, but also just a lot of general interest for myself. So it's something I really enjoy and hopefully something that I can really use, down the road. So two birds with one stone.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the psychology of the people that we coach is probably something a lot of people overlook,
Mhm.
and their whole mentality about how they perceive the training and also everything else that goes on outside the training. Because at the end of the day, if they're only hitting the gym 3 to 5 times a week for about an hour, there's a heck of a lot of time outside of those.
Yes.
So that's cool. That's really interesting. Um, do you do any with the coaching that you're doing with your group? Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So from the group perspective, it's really the same product as my individual perspective, individual program. It's a little more structured just because of the amount of people in it. So I drip out different information over the course of 12 weeks, but we really look at self first. So I run everybody through a disc behavioral analysis. It's based off of Carl Jung's work. But it just gives me a little better idea of who I'm speaking to and hopefully sparks a little bit of introspection and self-awareness for them as well.
Mm.
And just highlights the fact, we all do have biases, and different strategies and preferences that we individually kind of adhere to from both the communication and environmental perspective. And that shapes the way that we both give and receive information, how we perceive that information. And I think just the act of communicating and the act of being able to relate to your clients and be able to identify what their preferences and their biases are so that you can adapt your communication to them is just a great way to kind of add an aspect of familiarity to the training, right? To the training itself, as most of our clients are kind of coming into the process usually under some kind of, say sympathetic load, right? Where they're either very anxious about the training process because they're uncertain about it, right? If they were super amped about it, they probably wouldn't need us in the first place. So there's a high population of people who who are training because they need to, right? And they know they need to. So it's something they're unfamiliar. It's very novel, and sometimes it's very scary, right? And then we've got the other end of the spectrum where sometimes, we've got people who are, sympathetic for the opposite reason, where it's extremely anticipatory and it is something they're really jazzed up about. And they're the people who are more performance driven, and they're very, sport specificity or goal specificity driven.
Mm-hmm.
And understanding the drivers and the motivators for these people and how to kind of reach them from a communication standpoint can usually drive much better engagement, much better intent, and then, down the road, hopefully, or immediately, adherence, and that will lead us to behavioral change and physical adaptation. But typically most of our people, they recognize a good experience long before they start seeing physical adaptations, right? Or performance-based adaptations. So we start there. We start with ourselves. We look at strengths and limitations. And then we look at, how those strengths and limitations are actually affecting us from a business perspective, right? So there's a lot of people in the group that are kind of new in the training world, and they can still ride their strengths out, right? They're not to the point where they have diminishing returns on specificity at that point, right? So they can keep on pursuing or driving education, for instance, and that still has some leeway as far as building their business. But then I have some other people who've been in the game for a little bit, and they're kind of coming to me because they need a shift, right? They're looking to transition, or they're looking to develop other areas of their business, whether it be through the behavioral, psychological, or the business development realm. So at that point, they've kind of hit a point of diminishing returns on, say, education or development based on education.
Sure.
And now we're looking at filling in the gaps and raising their floor through business development, or ways to communicate better with their clients to, create a better overall experience. So we do strengths and limitations. We start building out, and identifying just things like core values, general purpose statement, training principles. We start looking at OKRs, which is just a goal setting metric, right? So objectives, key results, and strategies. Identifying big rocks, whether those are short-term and long-term goals, or just like the three biggest things that are happening right now that can have the biggest impact on their overall life or business. Identifying how we define success with those objectives, right? Whether they're quantitative or qualitative, we try to make them empirical and measurable so that we can identify, when we've reached a point where we're happy with them, so we can move on to the next thing. Because again, I think trainers kind of get stuck in the world of just getting better at stuff a lot. Well, I mean, people in general, I probably shouldn't, categorize, one group that way, but I think as humans, if we don't identify how we define success in a lot of different ways, we can kind of, quote unquote, get better into oblivion, right? Without ever really shifting or looking at things that might have might be a bigger area of opportunity down the road.
Yeah.
We do that. We build out systems, we build out strategies. And then we start talking about fitness, right? And we start talking about building out our actual training model from a methodology-based standpoint, from a programming and periodization standpoint. Very classical setup, but again, just having trainers kind of start identifying, what they look like from a phase selection standpoint, what they're trying to accomplish week over week, month over month through the training process, and how to incur those adaptations through programming, through periodization, through different exercise selections, through different, systems and methodologies. And then from there, we start aligning that up with what would be their experiential model, right? And this is where we identify how we want the clients to actually perceive the training itself, right? How we want them to feel about it. What we want to see from an outcomes perspective, based on that as well. Are we trying to educate? Are we trying to empower? Are we trying to build trust? Are we trying to build familiarity in the gym? Are we trying to dampen a hyperactive autonomic system, right? So that can branch off into a lot of different, areas as well. And then we kind of start trying to merge the two and trying to identify outcomes that we're looking for. And then from there, we start looking at business planning. I do a lot of business planning with my people as well. Looking at identifying, not just how much money they want to make per month or per year, because that's something that's actually extremely arbitrary and subjective to environment, right? So looking at what their expenses are, both fixed and variable, looking at what they want to allocate to savings and spending, and then looking at what tax bracket they're going to be in, right, to identify, kind of how much money they want to make or they need to make over the course of a month.
Mm-hmm.
And then we're looking at how many hours they want to work, right? Because again, making $2,500 a week is very different if you're working 30 hours versus working 60 or 70, right? It's a very different work schedule. And I'm a big fan of, kind of looking at time as the most important resource that we have, right? Because that is fixed. There's only 24 hours in a day. Money is just a tool, right? And I think identifying how efficiently you can make your income and how you can help people and how you can allocate that to a weekly and monthly schedule is going to be very important for people. So we start looking at that. That allows us to now create pricing and profitability margins for their business, and forecast out from a quarterly perspective what their earnings are.
Yeah.
And identify what they need to be doing, quarter over quarter rather than month over month to impact their lives from a quality standpoint. Start looking at building alternative revenue streams, whether that's, in-person, semi-private, or group, or looking at remote categories. We just go through a lot of different system development and try to look at things as holistically as possible, building community, marketing yourself, both, in person and online and in the social media spectrum, right? Identifying who your client avatar is, right? What they value, where they hang out, what language they speak, and trying to, again, shift your message to their preferences. Because the other thing that I see a lot of on social media, and I'm definitely no pro, but I follow a lot of trainers, and trainers tend to talk to themselves a lot on social media, right? And we all speak the language, and we love our acronyms, and we love our jargon, and we love our, anatomy and physiology, and we all like, likes and comments and engagement, but we're typically speaking to people who, again, agree with us from a belief system standpoint, right? You've got your tribes, you've got your PRI people and your FRC people and your SFMA people and your CrossFit people and your powerlifters, yogis and whatever. And we tend to just kind of, post, like, and kind of just pat each other on the back, give each other, a lot of reinforcement there, but nobody's monetizing it. Nobody's making money off of it, right? So we're not speaking to people who are actually our consumers, because most of the people that like our stuff have the same information readily available to them, right? Or they wouldn't even understand the language we're speaking, right? Because nobody outside of PRI people, for instance, knows what an AIC-BC pattern is, right? And what AFIR is, or even, what acetabulum is, without looking it up in a book, right? So when we're using these words, there's no way that a client base, somebody who might actually need our help, is going to be able to understand what we're saying to the effect that they'll reach out to us and say, hey, I would love to work with you. What capacities and what services do you offer? We're just going to get likes from people who share our belief system, and we might get, trolled a little bit from people who don't. And it's kind of the same thing over and over again. But it's not really reaching the people we want it to reach, and we're not getting out of it what we want to get out of it. So we talk a lot about that and just identifying those things. The individual process is really a lot of the same stuff. It's just more specific, right? We have the same materials, but we're also going through what that individual is, the obstacles they're facing day in and day out, week in and week out. So we have weekly calls, and we have a lot of materials and a lot of emails back and forth. And we make sure that, that I'm able to help them in the areas that they most need the help in, right? Or within. And so it's a lot of the same stuff. It's just a different context. The facility consulting stuff is sometimes more business development, sometimes more trainer education. And I've done everything from, building out internship, and employee development processes to people, to actually running through their numbers and identifying, pricing structures, profitability margins, policies and procedures, and going that route. Those are all things that I've done from much larger companies.
Hmm.
pretty easy to scale down
Yeah.
at that standpoint. So I get to do a lot of different things every day, because it very much changes, client to client, much like a personal trainer training their clients
Hmm.
does. And, so it keeps it really engaging for me. And yeah, it's been a blast, and I've really enjoyed it. So that was super long winded. I'm not sure if that was what you wanted, but uh, there it
Hey,
is.
it's perfect. Like I'll have a lot of people, as you said, who will be coaches who listen to this show. Because as you said, with coaches, we often support each other, and when there are interesting topics, we like to listen in. Um, so it's definitely a lot of good things there for a coach in terms of how they should price services and what they should look for with the behavioral stuff at the beginning as well, the DISC assessment and the um, different methods that rely around those similar principles is definitely things a lot more coaches should look into, especially as it comes to behavioral change, and as well as you mentioned, going on to talking about things like programming, because you mentioned things about like setting up a program and assessing people with that, and you mentioned some stuff around PRI. The breath work and PRI is definitely something that is coming through more and more on my social media, probably more because of who I'm being associated with. But if we were talking to someone who had no idea what we were on about, how would we start talking to them about, say, how their breath is affecting their performance, or how the relations from the pelvis to the rib cage is affecting their day-to-day training?
Yeah, I mean, that's a rabbit hole,
Yeah.
and I think for me, you have to start with respiration and breathing just in general, and what it does from an autonomic standpoint, right? Because training adaptation, regardless of the musculoskeletal system, it revolves around our autonomic nervous system, right? And how well we can manage allostatic load, how well we can switch from being, sympathetic versus parasympathetic, and what benefits come with each of those nervous system states, if we want to call them that. And the easiest way, or the most efficient way, I should say, for human beings to regulate their own autonomics is through breathing, right? And our cardiovascular system and our brain are very very closely connected, right? We can literally, increase our heartbeat and respiration rate just through thoughts, right? And we can decrease them much the same way. And in the counterpoint, if we see something, personally, or sense something, I should even say, uh, autonomically, again, usually subconsciously, even subcortically, our heart rate will quicken, and that will change the way that we think about things and how we react. We actually interact and react to our environment, right? So it works both ways, both efferently and afferently. Um, and as we start thinking about that process, and we start thinking about how it relates to training, there are parts of training where we want to be parasympathetic, and there are parts that we want to be sympathetic, right? Because those nervous states also affect things like our actual respiration rates and our aerobic development, our aerobic capacity, right?
Mm.
And our muscle tonicity, right? So the more sympathetic you are, the more hypertonic you are, which is great for lifting weights, right? But it's really poor for movement competency, right? And mobility and flexibility and things of that nature, right?
Mm.
Having a slower aerobic rate and improved capacity is great for a lot of things, but it's also not necessarily beneficial to everything, right? So if we're highly sympathetic, we've increased our respiration rate, but we have to go run a half marathon. We probably don't want to be super amped up at the starting line, right? Because we're going to end up expending a lot of energy out front, and we're going to be using our reserves early on and have to get into our anaerobic system earlier in the process, right? So how to manage these things based on your goal becomes very important from a fitness specificity standpoint, depending on what you want to be working,
Mm.
uh, let alone your actual lifestyle coherence and stress management and all that good stuff, right? So that's kind of the basis of respiration. And even before I got into PRI, that's something that I was, very focused on, as far as just trying to understand, how we can allostatically regulate um, or regulate our allostatic system at a higher at a higher capacity, just because that is kind of how we support our energy systems and how we function throughout the day.
Mm.
Uh, as I got introduced to PRI and gained more experience into it, I saw a lot of crossover with this, and that's why it kind of resonated with me probably a little higher than a lot of the systems that I've taken in the past, which, I've done, just about everything in 15 years, everything from literally teaching FMS to hundreds of people a week as a corporate development program to, going through the FRC process and a bunch of other stuff in between, DNS, some others. PRI just happens to be kind of the most recent of those. But I think just how they utilize breath and internal pressure, right, to affect the way we move really resonated with me on an individual level. And a lot of it is based around, being able to position and orientate the rib cage and the pelvis in a way that allows, the pelvic floor and the diaphragm to create internal pressure.
Mm-hmm.
And that creates more proximal stability, which allows you to move distally from an appendicular skeleton standpoint more efficiently and more effectively. And, when you look at some of these principles, I think every system, right, can probably agree that proximal stability kind of leads to distal mobility, right? That's something that's fairly well established. And, I'd always believed that, but I don't think I really ever understood how to create true proximal stability, right? We talk about bracing and we talk about kind of all these, proactive measures to work core strength, right? And to stabilize your pelvis and stabilize your rib cage. But at the end of the day, it's not really feasible to kind of walk around and, squeezing your abs and squeezing your glutes all day long, trying to make sure that you're maintaining that, right? So we can do that another way through intrinsic, right, activation or integration, right? And that's through pressure management, right? If we can create that cylinder, so to speak, with our core where we've got a diaphragm and a pelvic floor that are aligned and creating that pressure for us, well, now we've got, based on, position and orientation, we've got muscles that are firing the way that they're supposed to, right? So the other big component of PRI that always kind of stuck out to me and again was different from what I've learned in the past is position dictates function. Right. And the more traditional aspect where you learn kind of through FMS and through even the NASM OPT model and some of these others is that, if we're out of alignment, we can activate muscles to move bones back into alignment, right? If you've got an anterior pelvic tilt, just do some hip bridges, right? Just do a plank, right? And get your abs going, and that'll keep your pelvis in better alignment, and you're going to get rid of that lordotic curve or whatever it is. But again, that's not feasible if we can't make that autonomous, if we can't make that intrinsic. But if you can manipulate your position in a way that muscles are firing correctly, well, now you can stabilize both statically and dynamically through gait cycles, through different patterns. And that's something that made a lot more sense to me, as I started digging deeper and deeper into it. So as you get into PRI, that's kind of the primary, foundation that it's built on, right? Is that position actually dictates function. And if you can create the right position, the right muscles will fire, right? Because your nervous system relies on the position of the axial skeleton. And at the end of the day, muscles are pretty dumb, right? They don't do much without the nervous system, right? So again, both the central and the peripheral nervous system are going to dictate, muscle tonicity and muscle function, and what's firing, what's again contracting and releasing. And if everything's aligned correctly, if you're managing proximal stability, well, now you can move dynamically with better position, with better orientation, and with better actual patterning because of that. So breathing sets all of that up by allowing you to do that automatically rather than proactively.
Sure. So you're getting your breath to work in a certain position that this alignment creates itself, as opposed to you, as you said there, you don't need to do a plank for you to then have that position just for that amount of time. If you're working on your breathing, this is then happening automatically and then hopefully adjusting there.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's just looking at carryover, right? It's you. How many clients have you seen that can hold a pretty good plank, but as soon as they stand up or you load them, they kind of fall out of it, right? They pick a different strategy almost immediately.
Yeah,
Uh, Now we've created specificity for that muscle integration to that exercise rather than creating a position that now is, conceptually going to be contextual to everything you do.
sure. Yeah, and you've got compensatory mechanisms as well that can push in for isometric holds,
Mm.
especially if you're working potentially with someone remotely and you can't see this plank that they're holding for 7 minutes.
Oh, yeah.
And actually it's a position that you're not wanting to create at all.
Yeah, well, that's the biggest thing, is people will naturally adopt the strategy that they're strongest with, right?
Yeah.
And whenever, I always try to work with trainers on this because I think we're a little too quick. And this is kind of totally off the path, but sometimes we're too quick to take a strategy out, right, without replacing it with something else, and we end up with people who end up being more at risk of injury or potential pain because of that.
Mm-hmm.
And whenever I look and I'm walking down the street and I see people walking in front of me, whenever I see pronation of the foot, or I see a hip hike or elevated shoulder blades or slouching or whatever, those are all strategies, right? And typically that's just the body's way of creating locomotion or respiration for that individual the best that it knows how, right? Because it will move to efficiency.
Mm.
And if you're not aligned or orientated correctly, it will find a strategy that works for you, right? Because the task still has to be accomplished.
Mm.
And if we try to just take that away, but we don't replace it with something else, well, now we've got somebody with no strategies instead of somebody with a strategy. And that becomes problematic. And I think that's where you get a lot of kind of injury cycle with clients where, you'll provide corrective exercises or different exercise selections like planks and bridges and some of these things. And well, now we've taught them an exercise, but we haven't necessarily replaced the thing that's, keeping them put together while they're going through like a gait cycle. They're walking down the street or they're running or they're leaning over to pick their kids up or whatever it may be.
Mm.
And that's doing them a great disservice, right? We have to teach them something new before we take something away, right? So we need to replace a strategy or add to a strategy before we try to take another one out.
Yeah.
And understanding that, strategies are literally just your body's best way of getting something done. Your body doesn't know if something's detrimental, right? And again, the task itself is going to determine whether or not that thing's beneficial or detrimental. But your body is not really thinking about the best way to hold an upright posture, right, or whatever paradigm that we're looking at, or it's really just trying to get from point A to point B most of the time, and we need to be conscious of that as trainers, and as fitness professionals in general, I think.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, as you said, if you're going to take something away, we need to replace what they're using, because otherwise they're just going to be up shit creek without a paddle,
No
as the
plan.
expression goes. Yeah, no plan. So, I mean, going back to this rabbit hole we were talking of, what you were saying about creating this alignment first, how would one start to have that journey? Is that where it's literally just a case of, there are certain exercises that we could potentially do, but working with someone who knows their stuff is obviously going to get you the best results. But if someone was listening to this and they were like, oh, maybe I should start doing some things in my warm up to help me out. Like, are there places they can go? And, is there something that they can do?
Yeah, well, I mean, the actual like PRI site and the courses are obviously, that from an education standpoint, if you really want to dive deeper into this, that's where you need to go for it, most likely. But just from a general exercise standpoint, I think there's a lot of things that we can look at from just an orientation standpoint. Typically, what we talk a lot about is kind of gaining sagittal competency first, right? So if we're looking at it from a planar perspective, your sagittal movement plane is really the most basic and fundamental.
Mm-hmm.
And all that is, when you break it down into the simplest forms possible, is you're finding your mid-footed heels, from a ground perspective.
Mm-hmm.
You are using your hamstrings and glutes to some extent, really kind of the transverse fibers, to orientate your pelvis from the posterior side. and you're using your rectus abdominis, your ab muscles, to orientate it from the anterior side, right? And the hamstrings are going to pull it down into neutral from the back, and the abs are going to pull it up into neutral from the front. And then you're also going to have that same abdominal complex attaching into the lowest portion of your rib cage, right? And you're going to pull it down into a neutral posture as well, right? And most of the people that we see on a daily basis are kind of walking around with opposite integration, right? We see a lot of extension patterns where you have anterior pelvic tilt, you have weight in the forefoot, you've got these big extended, big chest rib cages with, flared ribs. And what we're really trying to look at is getting, the pelvis positioned over the heels and the rib cage positioned over the pelvis in space, right? If you're looking at somebody from the side, right, just standing up, that's kind of what we're looking at just from an orientation standpoint. And if you can get people neutral in that position, just how they're orientated spatially, right, against gravity, they will have hamstrings and abs, or they're going to fall over backwards, right? So you're going to have integration of the right muscles just from them staying upright. And that's kind of what we're looking at from a sagittal competency standpoint to start with. Now, as you move into gait cycles, as you move into more dynamic movement, now we have to add a frontal plane to that aspect, right? And we need to, at that point, we're going from 2 legs to 1 leg, right? We're going from bilateral to unilateral. And that means we now have to be able to balance over 1 foot, right? Because your hips shift as you go from one step to another, or they should, right? And that now requires you to be able to pronate an ankle, right? To pronate a foot and find your instep, define your adductors, define your glute medius, and define your obliques, in addition and layered on top of your hamstrings, your glutes, and your abs, right? So now we're adding another layer to that piece of the puzzle, or to that puzzle. And now we've got to be able to stabilize a rib cage and a pelvis over a single foot. And to be able to do that, those are the muscles we kind of need to be able to orientate ourselves in space from an anti-rotation standpoint. And that's gait cycles, right? That's looking at how we walk and how we run. You can add on top of that, now we've got scapulas moving contralaterally for arm swing. So we've got to be able to reach, protract, and retract from a scapular standpoint on a stable rib cage. And then after that, we get into, the transverse plane, and now we're just making that more dynamic. And instead of a rib cage stability perspective, right, we're actually now moving that rib cage. So we're moving the rib cage contralaterally over the pelvis. And that would be, your sprinting, change of direction, things of that nature, rotational work. So that's kind of how we look at it, just from a really basic standpoint. When I get people started from a sagittal competency standpoint, I'm really looking usually at 2 exercises for most people. I try to keep it as simple as possible. And if you go to my Instagram page, you're going to see them over and over and over again. But I use what we call a 90-90 hip lift. Yep. Where, we'll find a bench. For most people, kind of the 18 to 24 inches is pretty good, depending on how tall you are, how long your femurs are, even for that matter. And we're going to put your feet on the bench, and we're going to position your knees and your hips at 90-degree angles, right? So it's going to look like you're sitting in a chair, only you're laying on your back. Yep. And from that point, I'm going to have them tuck their pelvis under, so we can get a nice, flat lower spine, or a neutral spine, depending on where they're coming from. Some people are so extended, we're just trying to get them to neutral. Some people we're trying to overcompensate a little bit into a posterior tilt, just so we can get more hamstrings into the picture. And I'm going to have them dig their heels into the bench or the box or whatever it is, and slightly raise their hips off the ground, usually 1 to 2 inches, right? Just using their hamstrings, trying to keep the gastrocs out of it, trying to keep the actual abdominals out of it as well. We just want to, essentially manipulate the pelvis with the hamstrings only. They're going to be squeezing their glutes at the same time, which is sometimes really hard for people to do in that hip flex position. But that's actually what's going to also create a pelvic floor for them, right? So we can counter-nutate the sacrum and actually close the pelvic outlet through that mechanism. For some people, depending on the respiration pattern, we're going to squeeze the knees together to force a little bit of IR and adduction. For some people, we're not, right? So that's digging deeper down the rabbit hole and looking at exhalation patterns versus inhalation patterns. At the same time as that, I'm going to have that person usually reaching their arms straight up in the air and protracting their shoulder blades. And the act of protracting their shoulder blades also retracts the rib cage, which is really kind of what I'm after in that position, right? Because I want to get out of that extension pattern where the rib cage is over the forefoot standing. I want to move it back in space. Well, I can actually use the serratus and the abs to a large extent to move the rib cage back in space. So I want to protract the rib cage, and focus on kind of depressing and internally rotating the rib cage. And at that point, we're just going to hold that and we're going to breathe, right? And we're going to take full exhalations. Again, I say that like it's an easy thing to do, but it's actually very difficult for most people. And again, when I say full exhalations, I mean completely emptying the air out of the lungs, because that's where we're going to get, we're going to be able to actually manipulate the diaphragm, and we're going to get it to descend. And what we want is pelvic floor ascension and diaphragmic descension, from that standpoint. We want to create that internal pressure. And that action, I'll usually have people hold for anywhere between 3 to 5 deep breaths. There's usually a lot of shaking going on. With a little bit of a panic response as they fully exhale for the first time, maybe in forever. You see their eyes get super wide, right? And they take a quick, sharp inhale afterwards. And that's okay to start with. But we want to get to a point where we're okay doing that, right, with these drills. And that's kind of how we started, finding hamstrings through this process. And after that, the next exercise I use is what we call like an all four bears position, right? And it's literally the same position, but we're switching it to prone, right? So all fours on our hands and knees. I'm typically going to put the feet up against a wall just to get some sensory, bottom of the foot and find a heel against the wall there, rather than just having somebody do it, in the middle of a floor or something of that nature. And that's also a good way to kind of create some hamstring tension, because we can find heels in that position. So they're going to be, again, protracting their shoulder blades and reaching to retract their rib cage up in space. Want to make sure that we're not rounding the thoracic spine, right? I don't want this big, overly kyphotic curve, right? Just a natural, the thoracic spine does have a natural kyphotic curve, but we just want to keep it where it's at, right? We don't need to completely round the back like a big, U, upside down U. We're going to, tuck the tailbone again a little bit, squeezing the glutes, closing the pelvic outlet, using the hamstrings for that nature. And then we're going to start drawing the rib cage up, and we're going to do the same thing. We're just going to be doing it from a different angle. And we're going to be focusing more at this point on manipulating the rib cage versus manipulating the pelvis. So we're going to hit the issue from both ends, right? And the reason we focus again so much on the rib cage and the pelvis is, those are the two biggest structures in your axial skeleton, and they form your core, right? From that standpoint. And I know core is kind of a throwaway word, but that's basically what we're talking about, right? Just the axial skeleton. And those are the two biggest structures of it. And if we can manipulate the positions of those, we can get a lot more proximal stability from that standpoint. And then we're moving scapulas on a rib cage and femurs on a pelvis, rather than moving a rib cage on scapulas and a pelvis on femurs, right? And kind of that classic posture that we've all been taught, over the last 10 years or so, where we're, super rigid. We've got our scaps packed back in a full retracted motion. That alone will move your rib cage forward in space and cause thoracic extension, right? It takes out that kyphotic curve and it creates a very rigid and immobile spine. It also constricts your actual rib cage and decreases your respiration rate and your ability to take full inhalations, right? So if you've got aerobic athletes and they're packing their shoulders all the way back, you're actually going to be decreasing their aerobic capacity and their output simply because their rib cage isn't allowed to expand for inhalation, right? They're not able to get posterior expansion and actual, air back into their, posterior mediastinum, right? That's a big fancy word for, the backs of your lungs.
Yeah.
That we use a lot. And that's really what we're looking at, is if we can move scapulas on a rib cage, well, now we have the ability to actually start, compressing and expanding the rib cage for better inhalation and exhalation patterns.
Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah. It's basically about creating that 360-degree breathing pattern, isn't
Yeah.
it? And being able to breathe everywhere. And it's interesting how you talk about it in terms of getting the pelvis and the rib cage aligned in different positions, and focusing on full exhalations, which, as you said, a lot of people just won't have gone there before.
Yep.
And then trying to feel that pressure throughout the entire, the entire upper body. It's so interesting because coming from a singing background, we were all about sort of diaphragmatic breathing. And then, when you start to think about, breathing into your rib cage, you're almost like, this like so unnatural. But you're trying to, when you do get it right and you create that pressure, you're totally right. You get that, you switch on your core sort of more than you ever think. And if you start lifting in sort of those positions, you do feel more strength, I believe.
Yeah. And again, I always look at it, from a strategy standpoint, right? It's going to be beneficial and I see PRI, principles is probably more beneficial for outside of the gym than inside of the gym, which is another reason it resonates so much to me, right? I try to be, self-aware enough to realize that life happens outside of the training floor.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, it's all about, PRI is all about getting people to move better and more dynamically and more comfortably throughout their everyday life. When we're training on a gym floor, like there are some times where we adopt strategies that are counterintuitive to PRI, right? We do find ourselves in extension patterns. We do find ourselves doing like a Valsalva breathing technique, where bracing might be the best thing to do when you're trying to squat double body weight and above, right? You don't necessarily want to be trying to inhale and exhale your way through reps at that point. So again, I think you have to look at it objectively, and you have to understand that, based on the task I'm doing, I'm going to adopt different strategies for this, right? Both from a postural standpoint and from a respiration standpoint. And even from, I work with a lot of power lifters, and a lot of them, they've adopted these very sport specific positions that are based on extension, right? And they're based on getting really wide and really sagittal, right? And I typically don't change their compositions unless they're in, pain or discomfort of some kind, right? Like if somebody's arching their back on a bench, if I take that arch out and for a power lifter, I cut their bench in half, right? And they're no longer standing on a podium, right? Their shoulders might feel a little better, but that's not their primary concern.
Yeah.
If I take them from a sumo deadlift to a conventional deadlift and try to manipulate their pelvis into a more neutral position, they're also not able to lift as much, and that affects their performance, right? So sport specificity might play a role in this as well. But I think most athletes, whether they're field sport athletes or more sagittally based strength athletes, also need to be able to operate very effectively in extension, right? And one of the examples that I usually use with people is, you'll never see somebody do a max vertical jump with a neutral rib cage and pelvis, right? You have to be able to produce force with extension to jump as high as you can, and usually to sprint as fast as you can. And I think there, people sometimes go too far in the other direction as well, and where they're so focused on neutral that they're actually decreasing athletic output in other positions.
Sure.
And so I think, again, you have to be objective and understand time and place. And if I'm coaching an athlete, I want them to be able to perform in both, right? I want them to be able to be extended. I want them to be able to be neutral and flexed, and to operate those appropriate to whatever the task is at a high level. And try not to get stuck within one, kind of quote unquote posture that might be more, globally beneficial. And because sports themselves are specific, right? It doesn't matter if it's still a high variability based sport. It's still very different than what we do outside of the sport. So it's looking at the athlete and their abilities, what their task is and what their biggest limiters are, and trying to give them the best tools possible to succeed both inside and outside of the gym.
Absolutely. Yeah, because as you said, it's going to be down to what the person's function is, what the goals are, what do they need to be able to perform. As you said, with elite sport, a lot of the time they need to be, very specialized within that sagittal plane to be good at what they do. But having some variability of plane of motion will make them effective outside of that.
Yep.
Because, more often than not, people almost don't get injured, especially layman's people don't get injured in the gym. It's almost they, as you said, they go to pick up their kid or something odd off the floor, and
Yep.
then but their back goes.
Yep.
And, because it might be them rotating or changing direction or, moving sideways, and they just haven't got any competency in that pattern.
And,
People can mess themselves up that way.
oh, definitely. And that's where, from a training perspective, I look at what that athlete's task is or what that client's task is. And, for me, from a training perspective, I've got 3 different qualities
Mm-hmm.
that I'm probably looking to train with most people. And sorry about that. That's super loud. Where I'm looking at, movement and mobility. I'm looking at, aerobic systems, and I'm looking at strength. And within those 3 categories, I can look at that person and what their goals are, what their limiters are, and look at whether or not I want to train those qualities from a competency standpoint, which is just motor learning, right? Or a capacity standpoint, which is repeatable effort at low level intensities, or from an intensity performance based standpoint, which is non-repeatable max effort, velocity or explosiveness. And, for like a strength athlete at that point, right? Like I'm still going to train movement and mobility. I'm still going to train the aerobic system because I want them to be a human being. But based on the amount of time we can train and what they can put their energy towards, it's probably going to be more at the competency to low level capacity level, right? Where we're going to be driving strength at a high performance, again, depending on what part of their season they're in most of the time. But I'm not forgetting those things altogether. If I'm training a distance runner or an aerobic based athlete, again, same thing. I'm going to be training their aerobic system at a capacity level, right? Because I want them to be able to go for repeatable effort. I want a highly developed aerobic system. Movement and mobility, probably competency level, maybe capacity, and strength is going to be really low, right? It's going to be on really looking at competency and kind of minimum effective dose at that point, because strength is probably not a limiter for that athlete, right? I just want to be able to do enough to counteract like overuse injuries and things of that nature. So if I'm looking at the person in front of me, like I need to know how much specificity or variability I'm going to program into their meso and macro cycles based on that. And that's a very easy formula for me to start identifying those things.
Sure. Yeah, I love that. It's a great way to look at overall training phases, as you said, is look at them in the phase of the year, athlete, whether what sport they're in, what they need to do, and then those 3 things you can, as you said, just change up the volume depending on what they need to focus on at that point.
Yep.
Cool. I'm conscious of your time. The alert I recognize as the Google Calendar alert, so I'm aware that you'll have another appointment to get to. It's so rude. So if you could just finish us off with where people can go to find out more about you and what you get up to.
Yeah. So I'm probably the most active on Instagram, just compound performance _. And I post there a lot, and try to give out just as much, free information as I can. And I'm pretty active as far as responding to people from that perspective as well. And then my website, www.compoundperformance.com, has information on all the services I provide, both from a development and a training perspective. And then I'm on Facebook a little bit, just under Kyle Dobbs. I've got a compound performance page as well. I don't post as much on there just because I try to stay off Facebook. It's just not always a pleasant place for whatever reason. There's too much other stuff going on sometimes. But those are definitely where you can find me. And like I said, I sit in front of a computer most of the day, so I'm pretty active and usually have some of those windows open so I can respond back and forth to people.
Awesome. Cool. Well, I'll make sure to link those in the show notes as well. So thank you again for taking the time to come onto the show.
No, I appreciate you. Thank you so much for having me. It's been a
Cheers.
blast.
Cheers.